This is a book celebration for Professor Sherry Colb's new book, Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger and Other Questions People Ask Vegans. We have a terrific panel. I'm just going to serve as the moderator, so my job is just to introduce people and call on people and maybe ask a question if, you folks don't have any. So I'm going to have as is our custom, the speakers will speak first, our guests will speak, make comments, criticisms about the book, and then we'll give Sherry a chance to respond. And I'm going to introduce all of our speakers now, and then I'll just sort of call on them. And they're going to speak in reverse order of the distances it took them to travel here. So speaking first will be Professor Taimie Bryant, who is Professor of Law at UCLA Law School, where she teaches courses in property law, nonprofit organizations, and animals and the law. Much of her early work focused on Japanese family law. In the last decade or so, she's turned her attention to the law regarding treatment of animals and relations between humans and animals. So she will lead us off. She'll be followed by Mariann Sullivan, who is a lawyer and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, teaching, of course, in animal law there. She has taught variations of that course at just about every law school in the United States. Certainly all the New York metropolitan area, Brooklyn, Cardozo, NYU, now Columbia. I think she also taught a version of it when she was a visiting professor at Lewis and Clark. She's served as chair of the Committee on Legal Issues Pertaining to Animals of the New York City Bar Association and the Animal Law Committee of the American Bar Association's Tort Trial Insurance Practice Section. I know Mariann through her fabulous website and multimedia blog, Our Hen House, which she co-curates with Jasmine Singer, who's here somewhere. I saw Jasmine. Oh, there she is. Finally, we'll hear from Bob Hockett, who is professor of law here at Cornell Law School. Bob teaches and writes about the economics, organization, and regulation of financial institutions. In addition to his academic work, Bob has consulted and is continuing to consult with the IMF, has done a stint with the New York Fed. I think he's the only person who is consulting with the Fed by day and working with Occupy Wall Street by night. Bob has been in the news quite a bit lately as various municipalities around the country have been attempting to implement his proposal that they use the power of eminent domain to take failing mortgages. And you're probably wondering what all of that has to do with animals, veganism, etc. Well, Bob is himself a human animal. As I'm told are all of our panelists today. So anyway, without further ado, let me turn over the podium to Taimie.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be included in this book celebration. There is so much to celebrate about this book. The first time I read through the book, I was very appreciative of all of the information. I was appreciative of some answers that I could give to people who ask me about veganism. We get these questions all the time. In fact, a vegan colleague of mine suggests having lunch occasionally, and the rule is we don't talk about our choice of food. These questions come up so frequently that to have the kind of in-depth answers that Sherry provides is particularly helpful because it enables the conversation to go to deeper levels about veganism and its relationship to how we live our lives. Upon subsequent readings, though, I thought that for me, an equal, if not actually more important aspect of Sherry's book is the voice with which she writes. It's deeply authentic. It's self-revelatory in some breathtaking ways. But it documents not just what she has learned. It documents how it changes her. And this type of literature would be so useful in so many social justice fields. In the end, what she does is to connect veganism with its grounding in nonviolence, or stated affirmatively, with its grounding in peace. It's grounding in peacefulness. When my students ask me why I support veganism, I point to all of the violence around us, against people, against the earth, against animals, and at least what I can do is not bring that into my life, into my body, into the choices that I make as a consumer. That deep level is missing. I think it's missing in our consideration in a lot of contexts and in some of the questions that people ask us. It seems to me that many people do not actually go to that depth when making lots of different kinds of moral decisions. And so I'd like to just separate out two different types. I think Sherry's book falls into the first type, which I label Aristotelian. So what she's done is to ask the question, what kind of person do I want to be? And how do the choices that I make in life match up with the virtues I wish to enforce and the vices I wish to avoid? Another way of approaching moral dilemmas is to look for a proxy decision-making tool. What moral rules do we have that will guide my decision? And if you have a moral rule that you can easily invoke, not a virtue you're striving to attain, but you have this moral rule that you can invoke, you can make moral decisions relatively rapidly. It's one of the values of using that proxy. So then it turns on what proxy rule are you using. Sherry writes in her book a puzzle that I often experience as well, and that is the puzzle of vegetarian feminists. It is this choice to consume dairy and eggs by somebody who is feminist and also recognizes on some level the cruelty that is inflicted on animals as they are being turned into food. Yet it stops short, and I call this phenomenon a partial attention to the moral issues that some moral dilemma contains. So I don't quite understand this phenomenon. As I said, it's a puzzle. It's a puzzle as presented in Sherry's book. It's a puzzle for me. But I think that the proxy rule that's being invoked here is that it's wrong to take an animal's life for a reason that can be accomplished in another way. I don't think that the consumption of dairy and eggs is perceived to be as connected to death and killing as it actually is. And Sherry draws that connection out. But if you use as your proxy rule, it's wrong to engage in an action that is the direct result of the killing of an animal, you can stop there. If you are pursuing a virtue of kindness, you'll explore whether the dairy and egg industries actually do enable you to rest on that kind of a claim that no death is resulting from this consumption habit. We see lots of this, what I call partial attention. I was watching the documentary, I commend this documentary to you, called I Am. And it's a documentary in which Tom Shadyac used his considerable money from commercial successes with Ace Ventura and the Nutty Professor to travel the world to ask various scientists, thinkers, religious people, what's wrong with the world and what can be done about it. And in the context of this film, he presents information about the need for a paradigm shift where we see all of us connected to the earth, connected to not human animals, as well as connections to other humans who live in different places. He shows in this film many instances in which we have learned things from observing animals. And one of those things is the phenomenon of mirror neurons. So when an animal sees another animal suffering, the neurons fire in the observer's brain, replicating or mirroring the suffering that that observer is witnessing. Cut to the humans in the film, who also, when they observe the suffering of another human, will have the same mirror neurons fire in the brain as though they themselves are experiencing it. But absent from this conversation, which would seem to include the crossover consideration, missing is an examination of when humans see or observe the suffering of animals, when they experience it intellectually, what is the extent of neuron firing? And if we don't have neuron firing mirroring this, why not? Moral philosophers have looked at the question of humans' obligations to not human animals for a long time, but moral psychologists have not. And what we really need is more moral psychology. That is, how do humans take in information and use that information in order to make decisions they understand to be moral? We need more of that. And I think that until we have a better sense of that, we really don't know how to communicate the information successfully, even though we have information presented in so many formats that Sherry brings together in her book. Sherry talks about the inadequacy of many laws to deal with different aspects of the suffering inflicted on not human animals by humans. She talks about how, for example, the Endangered Species Act deals only with preserving the numbers of animals, not the experience of animals to be free from suffering. She talks about the status of animals as property, which enables them to be used as resources, such that the virtue or the value of efficient use of resources can be fulfilled. She also talks about the inadequacy of anti-cruelty statutes. Because our concern about the suffering of animals is so regularly cabined by what we perceive to be necessary as part of the process of turning them into human consumption products. In fact, Mariann was one of the first people to draw out all of these issues with respect to anti-cruelty statutes and how they absolutely do not operate with respect to animals going through the factory farming process. If a person knows that we have or assumes that we have anti-cruelty statutes, and they believe that the law is based on moral beliefs, moral values, they may use the existence of such a law as a proxy rule if they are the type of moral deciders who use a proxy rule as a guideline and then make a decision based off of that. When in fact, the use of those rules, the anti-cruelty statutes, is misleading. A fact that Sherry also brings out when she suggests that animal protection lawyers might best think about alternatives to pursuing such things as regulations that increase the cage space allocated to egg-laying hens or the cage space allocated to pregnant sows or veal calves. Really, intensive confinement of all animals used in this process is the hallmark of factory farming. But Sherry suggests that maybe we should think of another way. So I would like to end my comments with a consideration of one such way. And this is a law that was actually enacted in California fairly recently. But before I describe it, I'd like to describe the background, which is, if you want to present an alternative, a vegan alternative to a cruelly produced item, baked goods, clothing, whatever, it takes a lot of financial wherewithal as well as an extensive skill set to launch a restaurant or a bakery with a retail part of it, or to launch a business that produces alternatives to toxicity testing or an alternative to clothing produced in cruel ways. It takes a lot of money. So let's just take the case of a baker who wants to break into the business with vegan baked goods. Where would you do that? Well, you could start with a lower level, a lower scale than opening up a restaurant or a bakery. What you could do is sell your goods at farmers markets, sell them through restaurants that will include them as part of their dessert menu, sell them through stores that will allocate some shelf space to you. But in California, until recently, you couldn't sell products that you had made, these food products, without having used a commercial kitchen to produce them. Commercial kitchen space is expensive. It's fairly unusual. I mean, to allocate a commercial kitchen just for those people who want to break into the business by renting the commercial kitchen on an hourly basis, this isn't an efficient business model. So what these folks were doing was renting space from kitchens that are used commercially for a variety of more stable purposes. It was expensive. It was hard to get products from the commercial kitchen to the point of sale. So this new California law enables you to sell directly food products that you make in your home kitchen, as long as your annual sales do not exceed $50,000 in a year. This was a controversial law because a previous law was based on consumer health and safety kinds of rules. Did this make a difference? Oftentimes we wonder about that sort of thing. You know, you can enact a law, but if no one knows about it or uses it, what good does it do? But in this case, I and a colleague tested out the efficacy of this, the reach of this law. And our method was to go to a bunch of different farmers markets and talk to people who sell these vegan products. And we found that as to those people who were already selling vegan food products like cookies and muffins and things like that they were able to actually expand their product line. So to take one vendor, she expanded and now sells vegan box lunches to people. And she focuses on Japanese and Indian box lunches because she's had exposure or experience in both of those cultures. My colleague found the same thing at the farmers markets that he went to, that vegan purveyors of these food stuffs, they knew about the law, they used it in order to initiate their sales or to expand their sales. Now, it is true that the law doesn't focus on vegans. It's anybody. So you could have cruelly produced food products gain more market entry through this way, too. The vegan products, as Sherry points out, they have to stand on their own. They have to stand on their own in terms of quality and taste, right? But so far, they haven't been able to compete with the cruelly produced food items. This exposure, as Sherry points out, and I agree, this exposure to goods that consumers will then value and prefer can loosen the investment that people have in their desire to consume cruelly produced food items. So I see this as one of those successful outcomes where lawyers got behind something that has very positive effects for consumers as well as for animal protection. I think there are other cases, but and if people have questions about that in the question and answer, we can return. But for now, I think I'll turn it over to Mariann, right, as our next speaker.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here because I just absolutely love this book. It's really been a gift to everybody who's been a vegan for a long time. I assume there are some of you here. And I think one of the things I love about it comes from the fact that my career, though I now teach it at every law school in America or four, really was spent mostly at the appellate division, first department. So I read a lot of briefs and I waded through a lot of legal arguments. And I tend to see Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger really as a legal argument, as an argument made by a lawyer. And, you know, Sherry Colb is a very good lawyer. And vegans really desperately need a good lawyer. And they finally got one. There have been a lot of lawyers, or actually a few lawyers, who have worked on behalf of animals, and that's great, and they certainly need it, because animals have legal problems. Well, vegans don't exactly have legal problems in this sense. But what they do have is the obligation to make arguments in the court of public opinion, and they pretty much have this obligation all the time. If you're a vegan and you don't keep it a secret, you know exactly what I mean. You are frequently called upon to answer questions. You have to defend yourself. And in fact, you want to defend yourself. You want to promote your diet. You believe in the way you eat, and you believe in the goodness of it, and you want other people to know about it. But sometimes it can get tiring. And not until this book really has anybody really stepped up to the plate and inserted themselves in incredibly deft way into the very questions that vegans get asked all the time, and which, unfortunately, some of us are not quite as good as Sherry at answering. The most important thing to hold on to, and for vegans, is that we have to welcome these questions. Anyone who's serious about changing the world for animals, and most people who are vegan for ethical reasons have to recognize that it's not enough to just change our own eating habits, and it's not enough to make a personal decision. No matter how much we like it or not, we have to change other people's eating habits. And whether it's quixotic or not, we really want to get every single animal out, not just the ones that we would have eaten. So we have to answer these questions, but we're not all that well equipped to do it. Just because you believe in something, it doesn't mean that you have suddenly become a brilliant advocate for your cause. It doesn't mean that you're always at the ready to advance coherent, logical arguments in your defense. You're always willing to let the emotion go and just answer the question and not get emotionally involved, even if you're pushed really hard. You're always prepared with the facts, and you're able to state those facts in a nuanced way that helps your argument. Not everybody can do that, but that's exactly what lawyers are paid to do. That's what lawyers are trained to do. So vegans really need a good lawyer. Unfortunately, there's a certain DIY aspect to Sherry's book in that you can't actually just call her up every time somebody asks you an annoying question and have her come over and answer it. You do have to make the argument yourself. So perhaps the best way to think of it is that she has written your brief. It's kind of the English model. You're the barrister, you're going out there to make the argument, but somebody else really, really smart has written that brief for you, has put all your arguments out there, and now you know how to make them. So I think in my background as a court attorney, a person who dealt with a lot of legal arguments, I just think of this really as the vegan's brief. Like any compelling argument, and I did, of course, read a lot of them in that position, the affirmative argument is stated very simply. Frequently, that could be the case. There are lawyers who attempt to win an argument by complicating things. People who work at courts don't really like that approach. Sometimes you try to complicate things because you don't have a very strong argument. That could be a good idea. But if you have a good argument, you can state it pretty simply, and that's a really good idea. And Sherry Colb is a very good lawyer, and she has a very good argument. So she states her affirmative argument really quite simply. Quote, the ethical vegan chooses not to consume animal products because she views animal agriculture as violence that she does not want to support with her dollars. She considers it unjust to breed and confine animals and to subject them to unimaginable suffering and slaughter to satisfy her appetite for animal products. That kind of says it all. It's pretty simple. It's pretty compelling. But, of course, as anyone who's written a brief knows, you can't just state your affirmative argument. You have to anticipate the holes that they're going to try to put into your argument and get them into your brief up front. You don't want to have to wait until the reply brief because, I know it's rumored that the judges never read it, but sometimes it's true. The real trick is in anticipating the other side's arguments and refuting them. So it's crucial to think of what your opposition is going to say, how they're going to tear apart your elegantly stated argument, what holes they're going to poke in your argument, how to avoid the flaws in your reasoning, watch out for them before somebody attacks them, how to anticipate what facts you might not be putting forth that are really going to be necessary and they're going to point out that you left out, and how to avoid allowing somebody else to make everything seem much more complicated than it really is, because that is the art of being a lawyer with a losing case. Make it seem very complicated. And if you make it complicated enough, the judges in the court of public opinion will assume that this decision is too hard to figure out, that both sides have a good argument, and that's just not the case. The argument is unassailable. And this is where the bulk of this brilliant work, and it really is a brilliant work, does its work. Sherry anticipates every imaginable counter-argument. I've been doing this a long time. I think she really has come up with every possible counter-argument, and she answers it. She gives you that argument. She gets into the hearts and soul of the defenders of animal agriculture. And, of course, now her book becomes much more complicated than her elegantly stated premise, but she still, even though she goes into detail, she always brings it back and tries to simplify it. And to take the vegan question and make those who make it seem difficult obviously wrong, and show them that their arguments simply fail to make it difficult. It is not a hard question. It's an easy one. So, for example, one assertion, if you're vegan, you are fully aware of this you confront on a very regular basis, is the completely unassailable fact that some animals eat other animals. I mean, we know that's true. So the argument goes, it is only a natural part of life to eat other animals, and unless we simply want to reject nature itself, unless you're against nature, then, we can't really legitimately take the stance that it's wrong for us to eat animals. Sherry does not, as I usually want to do when I hear this argument, scream in frustration. Note to self. That's not how Sherry rolls. She takes the argument seriously. She deconstructs it into the two competing rationales underlying this argument, rationales that really don't have anything to do with each other. First, the idea that we should use animals as our role models for appropriate behavior in the world. And second, that our moral responsibilities to others are based solely on reciprocity. That's the sole basis of morality. And since animals, or at least some animals, don't refuse to eat us, why should we refuse to eat them? She then carefully breaks down each of these rationales into their component parts and demonstrates that in other areas of our lives we don't follow these principles. These are not principles on which anybody would want to run their life. And she does this with such patience, much more patience than I manage. And attention to detail and respect for the fact that her readers who are going to have to be making this argument are not academically trained philosophers. They're going to have to be able to confront people's concerns here in language that people can actually understand. And she goes far more than just helping us understand the arguments and refining them and make them well. Lawyers have duties to their clients. In addition to that, one often overlooked duty of the lawyer is to counsel their clients to manage difficult situations. The term counselor is sometimes too overlooked in the description of lawyers. And here again, Sherry steps up to the plate. Vegans are often seen by others as a problem. There's just no way around that. Maybe some people see vegans as a challenge. More likely they see them as a total pain in the ass. It's difficult for those of us who actually like to be liked. We don't actually want people to think of us as difficult. And yet our very existence seems to put some people's teeth on edge. And the questioning can sometimes feel like an attack. And one can get very defensive and not make very good arguments and just respond in an emotional way. I've been known to do it myself. And Sherry gives us the excellent counseling to just lighten up. It's not just about you. And taking that wisdom just a step further, she tells us that we need to welcome these questions, that she has come to see the challenging inquiries as more of a gift than a burden. She advises us to do the same. And that is exactly what we need to do. As I said earlier, we don't want just us to stop eating animals. We want everybody to stop eating animals. We want to stop this cruelty. We're never going to do that if we don't have an opportunity to tell people why we don't eat animals. And if they ask us a question, we don't have to force this information on them. So Sherry, as a good example of her way of communicating when asked a difficult question, she always brings patience. It's a wonderful virtue, and empathy even to her analysis. And this allows the vegan, who has given the subject long, hard thought, has made it an important part of their life, to recognize that questions that they might see as hostile or ill-intentioned are really not. They're just questions. So the standard inquiry, which I'm sure if you're vegan you have heard, what about plants? It's just annoying. What about plants? What are you talking about? What about plants? But Sherry understands that this questioner may never have thought about the question of what they're eating before. A lot of people have never thought about the ethical status of what's on their plate. So when they hear that somebody's vegan, they say they don't eat animals, the first question that pops into their head, well, all right, that makes sense because you have to kill animals, but you have to kill plants too. So what about plants? It's not hostile. It may not be. It could be. It may not be a hostile question, though. It may not be that this, you don't have to assume that this person is deceptively pretending to be advocating for plant rights. They're just asking, well, what about plants? How do you feel about plants? And of course, they haven't given a lot of thought to the important differences between non-sentient life and sentient life. And Sherry gives us all of the talking points and the thoughtfulness that we need to consider the difference between sentient life and non-sentient life, which is so important in thinking about this question. But the fact that somebody asks the question doesn't mean they're trying to trip you up. They're just asking a question. However, even though she demonstrates this very patient attitude toward even vigorously stated questions, she is never timid, and she takes on questions that nobody wants to take on, the kind of questions that you just dread as you're a vegan. And she's unafraid of talking on any subject, and she would approach subjects that many consider taboo. She goes to the religious issue. She deals with the biblical questions, which just give me a headache. And she actually managed, and she does not do this in a timid way. Even she's polite, but she's not nervous. She reinterprets the biblical prohibition on seething or boiling a kid in its mother's milk, interpreted, of course, in Jewish practice to require the separation of dairy and meat in kosher food. She reinterprets this to actually prohibit the consumption of the flesh of a baby animal, which ultimately leads to prohibiting the consumption of all flesh. That's a pretty bold statement. And many people, the religious question goes up, and I tend to avoid it myself. I just say, well, that's a religious issue. You know, what can I say about what your beliefs are? But it's so important that we confront these issues. Religion is the basis of most people's ethics. If we can't parse through that and really think about the underlying beliefs underneath people's religions and discuss that without being judgmental, but just honestly, we'll never get anywhere. She also never takes the easy way out. This is one of the most important lessons for any vegan who's trying to make a case against animal agriculture, and any lawyer knows that, you know, there'll always be a point you can win in your case. There'll always be some easy remark you can make, but you don't want to win a point. You want to win your case. You can't avoid the counter-argument. And one of the things that I think she just does so brilliantly here is in talking about dairy and eggs, which, of course, is a place, dairy and eggs is the place where people go when they decide that maybe it is problematic to eat flesh, but I can still eat dairy and eggs. And so it's very easy, considering the horror of the way that animals are raised for dairy and eggs in factory farms, to just go there and talk about the factory farms, because the exploitation of these animals is truly mind-blowing. And there are very few people who, confronted with the idea of factory farming, don't agree, at least in their heads. But perhaps their minds are going in another place, and perhaps they're not even overtly telling you where their minds are going. And that tends to be thinking, well, I don't have to buy factory farm products. Of course, that's bad. I don't want to participate in that. But I can just buy appropriately sourced products for whatever they think. And, of course, this is the way many, many people go when they think about these issues. And so Sherry does not, even if that question is unstated, it's so important to confront it. And that's what this book helps you do so much, because she goes right there to the inherent problems in eating these products, and the inherent cruelty, and the fact that no matter how humane your particular provider is, you can't avoid these questions. And if you're going to really think about the ethics of your eating, you have to think about them. There are other ways in which she helps us as a lawyer, in which she writes this brief. It's not just always answering a question. Sometimes before you answer a question, you need to understand the question. And sometimes people don't state the question exactly in the way that they mean, because they're holding things back, some things that they don't even know about. And Sherry helps us understand the questions that people ask us in very subtle ways. There is frequently unstated subtext, and that always happens when emotional issues are at hand, and there are a few more emotional issues for anyone than what is on their plate and what they ate for breakfast. And so Sherry helps us dismantle what are really some hidden assumptions and veiled assertions within questions that may not be stated. And that's because these questions are really fraught with anxiety. And she does it not so we can show up the questioner, which is very tempting to do, and it's very tempting for people trained as lawyers to do. But that is not what we want to do here. We want to actually empathize with the questioner, understand the question in these subtle ways, so that we can see where they're coming from. We can see what the real issue is. And like any good litigator, she gives us psychological insights into what people are really thinking and what is behind perhaps some of these questions. And one is her understanding that, quote, we are not simply moral or immoral individuals. We are also pleasure seekers and pain avoiders. It's so easy for lawyers to forget, for everyone to forget, that just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to win. A logical argument can go so far, but when we're talking about people's personal decisions, even when you're talking about decisions that are made in courts, there are many, many factors that go into whether you have a winning argument. And the fact that you have logic on your side is only one of them. So the fact that that you have to understand that people's pleasure and people's pain is important to them. And that really does more to self-justify their actions than their thought processes. It helps you understand how to address their concerns. Most people have conflicting feelings about eating meat. They're uncomfortable about killing an animal, and yet they desire to continue eating the foods they've always eaten and that they enjoy. And they can resolve that question by thinking, well, by the time the animal is on their plate, the animal is dead. I mean, what can I do about it? And Sherry's recognition of this, I mean, it's an obviously flawed assumption. But unstated assumptions don't have to actually make sense in order to self-justify people's actions. So she makes clear that we have to let people know that yes, you can't actually help the animal that's on your plate. But once you're consuming these products, your consumption fuels and rewards production. We will never put an end to this suffering unless we stop funding it. And as long as we fund it, it will continue. And that may seem such an obvious point. But if nobody ever asks the question, you may not have an opportunity to confront the fact that that is really underlying their thought processes. Perhaps the insight that struck me the most is her observation that people are astonishingly inept at figuring out what circumstances might lead them to become or to remain happy. I think that is just a remarkable statement. It's so friggin' true. None of us would be unhappy ever if we really knew how to make ourselves, well, except for the occasional disaster that befalls us. But so that can show us as vegans ways to improve our messaging, realizing that people just really don't understand what will make them happy. But I think that what really resonates with that comment for me is that it gives me hope, and I think it gives other vegans hope. If we can remember that people seemingly absolute conviction that they cannot live without, say, bacon or whatever other product, if we can really understand that their need to feel that this is a necessary part of their life and they will never have pleasure again if they don't eat these products, if we can understand that that's just the result of ineptness, that's something that you can get around. It's really not that deep, and it's something that you can work with. And it really made me, so much in this book gives me hope. Not does it give me good arguments to make, but it gives me hope. But that, I think, is the crucial element of the book that gives me hope, is that we do understand that so many arguments that people have in favor of this just horrifying nightmare of exploitation that we have visited upon these billions and billions of creatures for really what seems to any vegan for no reason whatsoever, that it's just kind of a mistake, and it actually can be rectified. So Sherry has actually written a book that I believe that if it were widely read would change the world. I think it would really change the way people act. Of course, not everybody's going to read it. People tend not to read books that counter their assumptions. But every vegan can read it, and every vegan can use it. And everybody who cares about animals can read it, and they can use it, and it can make their arguments better. And in that way, Sherry's book can have that influence that perhaps isn't going to allow people necessarily to buy the book and read it themselves. And then eventually they will, and you'll get very rich and be able to retire. But until that day, she'll be here, and people will be reading the book and spreading the word, and they finally, as I said, they finally have a lawyer, and they finally have a great brief.
So I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief. So when I was in my late teens and early 20s, one of my favorite authors was the Danish writer Soren Kierkegaard. Some of you have heard of him, probably referred to as a philosopher, maybe the so-called father of existentialism. Other people talk about him as a Lutheran theologian or perhaps a generic Protestant theologian. Kierkegaard himself always described himself as a poet. He called himself a poet with a project. His project, as he called it, was to do what he called introduce Christianity into Christendom. In connection with that claim about himself, people would ask him sometimes whether he was a Christian, and he would say, no, he's not. That would be too exalted a claim to make for himself. Instead, he thought of himself as an aspiring Christian, or somebody who was trying to become a Christian. I think of myself as being occupying a similar position with respect to veganism, although I'm certainly not any great writer on the subject, certainly not as prolific as Mr. Kierkegaard or Dr. Kierkegaard himself was. But I think of myself as an aspiring vegan in the sense that I actually do think of it as a somewhat exalted state, a better way of living in harmony with the world, but a way of living that's very difficult to attain to. It's a very difficult state to reach. I suppose as a sort of ambivalent and characteristically guilt-ridden Catholic, I think of it as an attempt to be a truly Franciscan sort of Catholic, which is, again, a very difficult thing to be or to become. There are various reasons that it's difficult to become a full vegan or to become a real exalted vegan, as I'll call it. There are various logistical challenges, let's put it that way. And when you have challenges, when you face challenges of this sort, it's important to have friends and support groups. And there's no better friend that I've ever known in this connection than Sherry. So let me say maybe just a little bit about what some of those challenges can be, and then how Sherry has actually helped me kind of navigate through the challenges, and then how the book basically characteristically sort of captures what Sherry has been to all of us who know and love her. So I first decided to become first a vegetarian, which I thought of as being, basically I didn't draw the distinction. I didn't even know that there was a distinction back when I first started to become a vegan. I was becoming a vegetarian back when I was 19. That was a long time ago, and I've, needless to say, fallen off the wagon multiple times since then, owing to this large number of challenges. So on the one hand, there are just really profound dietary logistical challenges. The entire economy, the entire food economy in particular, is sort of built upon the assumption, right, that we're all going to be eating meat and using animal products. That means you don't find, right, complete proteins that lack animal proteins real easily, right? It's difficult to sort of put together the right proteins, and if you do it in a kind of a half-assed way, pardon the expression, you'll find yourself facing health consequences, as I myself did in my early 20s. In addition, it's hard to know sort of where even to go shopping for certain things. It certainly used to be way back when I was 19, but it continues to be difficult now, although admittedly here in Ithaca it's a little bit easier than in some places because, after all, it is Ithaca. We have our own currency too, right? We have Green Star and others. But in many parts of the country, of course, it can be very difficult to find the right places to go for the right foods, let alone to know what foods you should even be looking for, and again, what proteins you have to combine, what foods you have to eat with which foods. So when I decided to get serious about the sort of the vegan goal again, and came to know Sherry, of course, I found myself constantly asking Sherry questions. You know, how should I do this? What should I put together? What can I eat? What can't I eat? How can I put things together in order to get those complete proteins? And Sherry was always there to help. So anytime you had a cry for help, a cry for vegan help, I'll call it, there was Sherry to answer it. In addition, there are various social logistics challenges, right? It's difficult sometimes to know precisely how to navigate a social world that also assumes that animal products are going to be being used and eaten. you're at a party or you're invited to a party and people ask you if you have any dietary restrictions. If you know that you're the only one who's trying to be vegan, do you sort of assert yourself and say, well, yes, I'm a vegan, or do you say, well, I don't want to cause too much trouble, if you got something vegetarian, that would be great. Sometimes you're not sure how much to assert yourself. I've had a tendency to be kind of Woody Allen-esque in my veganism, in the sense that I've probably been sort of shy to a fault about asserting my preference for vegan foodstuffs at various gatherings. There's also the way you don't want to seem like you're being kind of high and mighty or sort of holier than thou with some folk. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be cowardly about it, and you don't want to sort of keep it completely hidden. Otherwise, you're not going to sort of have any kind of transformative role at all. And we all hope, I think, all of us who are aspiring to veganism, we all hope to be sort of in our incremental and again, humble ways, mildly, little by little, transformative. In figuring out how to deal with those kinds of social logistical challenges, it's of course helpful to have support groups and friends who you can talk to and ask their advice. And how do you handle a situation like this? I'll never forget a lunch I had with Mike once when I was sort of off the wagon for a bit, and I actually almost said, "Do you mind if I order the cheeseburger?" It was actually the tuna melt or something, and I had never thought of this, but Mike said, "Actually, I would rather you don't ask me at all, because there's no right answer to that. If I say yes, I feel like I'm being oppressive. If I say no, I don't mind, then I feel like I'm endorsing you. It's better if you don't even ask." And I thought, oh yeah, I hadn't even thought of it. That's Mike and Sherry who sort of brought that to me. But basically, having a friend who you can talk to about these things is also immensely helpful in sort of finding your way to the path that you think is the right one here. Another challenge that you face is what I'll call rationalization resistance. So we've all probably, or at least a lot of us have probably read the autobiography of Ben Franklin, right? And so Ben Franklin, as you know, went through a period where he tried to be vegetarian, but he found himself so tempted by the savory smells of various meats that people were cooking that he kept wanting to eat meat again, and he was looking for some excuse to get off of his vegetarian path. And then one day he was in the back of a fishing boat, evidently, and a big load of fish was dumped on the back of the boat, and fishermen sliced open one of the fish, and a bunch of little fish, kind of spilled out of the belly of the bigger fish. And Franklin says, well, if you guys can eat one another, God, I guess I can eat you too then. And it's right back to meat eating. Basically because of this, again, the social logistical problems and the sort of dietary logistical problems that you face when you're first getting on to this path, you find yourself particularly, I think, vulnerable to that kind of rationalization. Or if you smell bacon and you really love the smell, which I confess I do, even though I'm sort of horrified at the same time, you need sometimes some help in resisting rationalizations. You need, basically, it's almost like, I suppose, an alcoholic who feels like he's about to fall off the wagon again. You got to call your sort of sponsor in AA or whatever, say, oh, I smelled alcohol again, and I'm really tempted. Can you help keep me off this? Sherry is that person too. Maybe not. Unfortunately for her, but it's helpful to have friends in that way as well. And then finally, this is a little bit more highbrow, but it's also helpful to kind of have people you can talk to about just what the actual ethical principle is that you're trying to conform your life to as you start pursuing a vegan path, right? Because as you all doubtless know, there are various ways in which the vegan path can be justified philosophically. There are the sort of Peter Singer utilitarian or welfarist types who think of it in terms of suffering and suffering avoidance. There are somewhat more Kantian, believe it or not, animal rights advocates and vegans who think of it in terms of a sort of recognizing or feeling, acting on a particular awe for a particular kind of agency, even if not fully human rational agency, something kind of moving in that direction. And then there are more sort of Aristotelian understandings of why one might do this. And those of us who are, people who are reflective, as most of us law professors are, I take it, sort of, actually as any lawyer would be, anytime you're looking for a sort of a ratio decidendi for a decision that's found by a court, you're also looking for ratio decidendi in respect of particular decisions that you might make in a dietary way. And it's important then to have have interlocutors that you can sort of discuss all of this with to sort of figure out precisely what the principle is and what its extensions are in order to help you resolve particular sort of hard cases, believe it or not. One of my own quandaries, this will sound comical, was I had a friend, I actually still have a friend, who has a lot of pet chickens. And so they raise these chickens and they treat the chickens as their friends and their pets. And of course the chickens continue to lay eggs, but they're not exploited. And it's a great source of animal protein. So of course I asked Sherry and Mike, is it okay to eat these particular eggs? And so we kind of go through it back and forth and sort of think it through. It's important to have that too. Now, how does this all come down to the book? Well, Sherry and Mike both, but especially Sherry, have been so helpful, again, personally to me over the years in navigating these various treacherous shoals that I've often found myself thinking, you know, everybody ought to have a Sherry, or everybody ought to have a Sherry and Mike, or it's too bad we can't bottle or box Sherry and sort of give her to everybody, right? And in a certain sense, that's what the book does, right? The book is sort of bottled Sherry, right? Everybody in the country, everybody in the world can actually have, in effect, what we have in Sherry in this book, because it's a very practical, how-to, specific question-answering book, but it doesn't shy away from discussing broader principles and broader considerations, economic considerations, social considerations, sociological considerations, every consideration under the sun, but in a kind of a broad, principled way, but again, also in a very highly specific, very sort of practically helpful sort of way, in the way that some of those books that you find in some of the self-help sections of some of the bookstores do as well. And it's a remarkable combination in that respect. So I think what I would do to sum up is to say vegans not only need a good lawyer, but vegans need a good friend, or they need a good group of friends. Sherry's the best such friend I can imagine, and the book kind of is a sort of captured, instantly available to everybody in the world friend, that friend that we know as Sherry. Thanks.
Hi. Good afternoon. I want to, first of all, I just want to express some gratitude to people here. I'm so glad that you all came, and I'm grateful that you took time out of your schedules to be here and to be open and thinking about these issues that don't often come up in law school and in everyday life. I also want to express gratitude to the people who came here, often long distances and confronting the nightmare that travel has become, and for reading the book and thinking about it and saying such incredibly kind things about it. It's really it's an honor to me to have you here, and also I want to express gratitude to the institution here of Cornell that has supported my work and has, you know, and it celebrates it. And this book means a lot to me in a way that well, all my work, of course, means a lot to me, but this means something special to me, and so I'm just filled with gratitude. So, and I'm so moved by the things that you all said today. First of all, I wanted to talk about Taimie's discussion of the California law, because if there's one thing I'm not all that nice to in the book, it's the idea of legal change. And I think that the California law that Taimie describes sounds wonderful to me, actually. Because I know in my own experience, I have friends who are incredible vegan cooks, and they confront the problem of the commercial kitchen issue. And it's actually a very live issue, not one that I had thought about at all before becoming vegan. And I have friends in California, actually, so this is exciting news, who want to be caterers, but they say you can't make your kitchen certifiably a commercial kitchen if there are animals around. And, of course, I snidely said, unless they're dead. So, you know, because they have a dog and a cat and they're alive and they're not part of the meal. Anyway, so that I think this is great, and I think it also sort of gives a sense of where the promise in law is for animal rights and for veganism, which is that it allows people to be activists. I think it was Kunstler who said that the role of the lawyer in activism is to support the activist, not to be the activist as lawyer. And one way to support activists is to permit them to do their thing, to exist, right? So how are people going to know that vegan pastries are just as good as non-vegan pastries if they don't get an opportunity to taste those pastries? And this law potentially can allow people to get out there and sell what they've baked. So that's a very exciting thing. Another area where I think law can provide a lot of promise is in empowering people who are in institutional settings to be animal activists. So, for example, a prisoner who wants to eat a vegan diet actually faces serious obstacles in doing that, which makes no sense because this food is not more expensive. Often they just want rice and beans, and they have the hardest time in the world getting the prison to cooperate with that. And so utilizing legal tools, for example, arguing that veganism is a kind of religion and should therefore fall under the institutionalized people's rights within that context, RLUIPA, is one way of doing that. Getting vegan food into schools is a very important step that is actually quite challenging. If you wonder why as a kid, in case you didn't like those containers of milk as a kid and wondered why they're there, that is sort of an across-the-board thing. And even though large sections of populations attending public school are lactose intolerant, and so rather than providing people with an alternative that's actually edible for them, they provide you with enzymes. Imagine if people gave out grass and said, no, you can't eat grass, but here's some enzymes to pour on it, and then you can digest it. You'd probably say, I'd rather eat something I can digest without the poured-on enzymes. But we have such an entrenched dairy industry that isn't what's on offer. So I think the law, I don't think I did enough in the book to acknowledge the role of law in facilitating activism. And you know, what makes this movement different from a lot of other social movements is that those who are at the end of the rifle here are the animals, and those who are pressing forward are the vegans, and so there are different populations. And therefore the vegans need to have certain rights in order to protect animals, but it's not that the animals are getting the rights directly through the law. And I think that the way this movement works has to be through individual action and group behavior rather than through the law, which is an inherently conservative institution. And I think, you know, you sort of get that in law school. I love the characterization of this as a brief and of me as the vegan's lawyer. Mariann, that is such a sweet and kind and honoring thing to say. And my hope is that this brief will be read by non-vegans as well as vegans, because I mean it to be responsive to people's questions, and I do take the questions seriously. You know, I'm not always patient. I love the idea that I would always be patient. I think if you ask my kids, you would get the reply brief on that score. But I try, and so it's really a thank you for saying what you've said, and then. Finally, I'll say that, Bob Hockett, it's great to be your friend. I'm not sure I want to be in a box or a bottle, but I'm glad if the book provides a proxy for that, and I don't need to live in a bottle or a box. On the complete proteins, I must say, Bob, that you need to reread one of the chapters, because you don't have to combine proteins. That's a myth. It's what people used to think in the 70s, that, oh, you have to combine the rice and the beans. I mean, I like rice and beans, frankly, but you don't need to do that. You can basically eat beans, nuts, grains, seeds, vegetables, and you will get the protein you need. We don't have a protein deficiency problem in this country. So I really felt the need to say that, and so don't worry about protein. But I think that the social thing is true, and it's really important to have people who take what you're doing seriously and who care, and who want to support what you're doing even when they aren't there yet. And I find that here at Cornell and in my friends and colleagues and family and students. So I thank you all for being that for me.